Effective this quarter, the Lindquist account has been reassigned to house management for strategic realignment purposes. That single line, buried in a routine CRM update email, was the entire explanation I ever received for losing the largest client relationship I'd spent 4 years building, a relationship worth nearly $1.1 million in annual recurring revenue, and roughly $200,000 in commission I'd been counting on to close out the year. I read that sentence 3 times before I understood it wasn't a temporary hold or an administrative error. Someone had quietly moved my account out from under me, and by the time I noticed, the paperwork already made it look routine enough that questioning it felt almost paranoid. I want you to remember that sentence, because everything that follows is going to show you exactly how deliberately it was written and exactly what it was covering for. This isn't a simple story about losing a client. There's a much bigger reason behind it, and I need you to stay with me to see how it unravels. My name is Marisol. I was 35, a senior account executive at a mid-size industrial equipment distributor, and for 4 years I had personally managed our relationship with Lindquist Manufacturing, a client I'd originally landed myself through a cold outreach campaign nobody else on the team had bothered running. I want you to understand what 4 years of managing an account like that actually looks like, because it matters to everything that follows. It wasn't a single sale and a maintenance renewal. It was quarterly site visits, late-night calls when their equipment went down on a weekend, personally walking their procurement director through every contract renegotiation, building the kind of trust that meant when a competitor undercut our pricing 2 years in, Lindquist stayed with us specifically because of the relationship I'd built, not because our numbers were better. My manager, a man named Tobias, had joined the company 18 months earlier, brought in from a competitor with an impressive resume and a reputation for turning around underperforming territories. He was charming in meetings, quick with numbers, the kind of manager who always seemed to know exactly what senior leadership wanted to hear before they finished asking the question. I liked him well enough, for most of those 18 months. He was demanding but not unreasonable, and he genuinely seemed invested in the team's success, at least on the surface. He remembered small details about people's lives, asked about my daughter's soccer season, sent a genuinely thoughtful note when my father was in the hospital briefly the year before. I had no reason to suspect anything else until the quarter Lindquist quietly disappeared from my account list. Looking back, there were smaller signs I simply didn't know how to read at the time. Tobias had started asking, casually, in one-on-ones, which of my accounts I considered most stable, and which felt more at risk of churning to a competitor. Questions that sounded, at the time, like ordinary managerial diligence, checking in on the health of the territory. I answered honestly, the way I answered most things with him, because I had no reason yet to wonder whether those questions were building toward something else entirely. I called Tobias the same afternoon I received that email, genuinely confused rather than upset yet, assuming there had to be a simple explanation I was missing. Strategic realignment, he said, when I asked directly. Leadership wants our largest accounts managed at a house level going forward, to reduce single point of contact risk. It's not personal, Marisol, it's just where the company's headed. Reduce single point of contact risk was a phrase I'd never heard applied to any other account on the team, before or since. I asked whether other reps were losing their largest accounts too, under this same new policy. He told me he couldn't speak to other territories, only mine. Something in the careful way he said it, the small pause before only mine, stayed with me longer than the rest of the conversation, though I couldn't have told you exactly why at the time. I sat in my car in the parking lot for a while, after that first phone call with Tobias, replaying the conversation, trying to decide whether I was overreacting to a phrase or correctly reading something underneath it. I didn't have an answer yet. I just knew the feeling in my chest didn't match the reasonable, corporate explanation he'd given me, and I'd learned, over 4 years of reading clients well enough to keep them, to trust that particular mismatch more than I trusted a calm voice on the other end of a phone. It was only when I checked my commission statement at the end of the quarter that the full weight of what had actually happened hit me. The Lindquist account hadn't been reassigned to some anonymous house management pool at all. It had been reassigned directly to Tobias's own employee ID in our CRM system, with him now listed as the account's primary relationship owner entitled to the exact commission structure that used to be mine. I want to be honest about how disorienting that discovery felt. Tobias was my manager. Managers overseeing account reassignments wasn't unusual on its own. What was unusual was a manager assigning a major account directly to himself, under a personal employee ID, rather than to any of the actual account executives on the team he was supposedly managing. I remember reading the ownership field on that CRM record 3 separate times, certain I was misreading it, certain there had to be some intermediate step I was missing before it landed permanently in his own name, instead of a generic house account, the way the original email had implied. I brought my concern to a coworker I trusted, a data analyst named Genevieve who managed our CRM system's back-end reporting and had, over the years, developed a reputation for noticing details other people glossed over. I asked her, carefully, whether reassignments like mine were typical. "Not like this," she said, pulling up the reassignment history on her own terminal. Account transfers between reps usually get routed through a formal change request, with a manager's approval and a brief justification logged in the system. Yours doesn't have any of that. It just shows a direct ownership change, time-stamped, with Tobias's own login as both the person requesting the change and the person approving it. That detail sat with me uncomfortably. A manager approving his own request to take over a subordinate's largest account wasn't just unusual. It was, at minimum, a serious conflict of interest that should have required someone above him to sign off. Genevieve pulled up the exact timestamp of the change, cross-referencing it against Tobias's calendar, which, as a manager, was visible company-wide by default. The reassignment had gone through at 6:47 on a Friday evening, well after the office had emptied out for the week, a detail that struck both of us as deliberate rather than incidental. Nobody processes a routine strategic realignment at 6:45 on a Friday unless they specifically want it to slip through with as few eyes on it as possible. "Has this happened with other accounts?" I asked her, almost afraid of the answer. She pulled up a broader search, scanning reassignment logs across the whole sales team for the past year. What she found made my stomach turn in a way the first discovery hadn't quite managed. 4 other major accounts, across 4 other reps on our team, had been quietly reassigned the exact same way over the past 10 months. Direct ownership transfers to Tobias's own ID, each one our team's single largest client relationship, each one representing the highest commission tier in our entire compensation structure. I want to be honest about who I actually suspected first, because it wasn't only Tobias. I initially wondered whether a coworker named Preston, a fellow account executive who'd been noticeably chummy with Tobias since his arrival, might have been feeding him information about which accounts to target, flagging our strongest relationships, perhaps in exchange for some kind of favorable treatment of his own. Preston had, admittedly, kept every single one of his own accounts throughout this entire period, which struck me at first as suspicious in its own right. I brought this theory to Genevieve, half-formed, still trying to make sense of a pattern that felt too coordinated to be one person acting entirely alone. She was patient with me, but ultimately skeptical. "Preston's accounts are all small to mid-tier," she pointed out. "None of them would have been worth Tobias's time to personally absorb. The 5 accounts that got reassigned are specifically the 5 largest commission-generating relationships across the entire team, regardless of which rep originally owned them. That's not someone feeding him tips about which reps to target. That's someone with visibility into every rep's numbers, systematically taking the biggest ones for himself." I sat with that correction, a little embarrassed at how quickly I'd reached for a more complicated conspiracy involving a coworker rather than accepting the much simpler, uglier truth. Tobias didn't need anyone feeding him information. As our manager, he already had full visibility into every account's value. He'd simply use that visibility to systematically claim the most valuable relationships for himself, 1 quarter at a time, disguised each time behind vague language about strategic realignment that most reps, understandably intimidated by a manager's authority, were unlikely to challenge too hard. I actually apologized to Preston, awkwardly, weeks later, once everything had come to light, for the suspicion I'd quietly carried about him without ever voicing it directly. He laughed it off more easily than I expected, admitting he'd noticed the pattern of reassignments himself, and had simply assumed, the same way I initially had, that there had to be a reasonable explanation somewhere above his own pay grade. I figured if it was really a problem, he told me, somebody smarter than me would catch it eventually. I didn't have the heart to tell him that the person who eventually caught it wasn't smarter. She was just willing to ask one more question than everyone else had been. Here's the piece that took the longest to understand. Because on the surface, a manager padding his own commission numbers seemed almost too simple an explanation for something this carefully executed. Genevieve, digging further, found something in an internal company announcement from several months earlier that reframed everything. Our company was in the early stages of merger discussions with a larger competitor, an announcement that had been shared with senior staff under confidentiality, but had clearly filtered down to at least some managers ahead of the broader team. Buried in details Genevieve found through a colleague in finance, the merger terms included retention bonuses for sales leadership tied directly to demonstrated personal revenue generation over the preceding 12 months, a bonus structure that rewarded managers who could show, on paper, that they personally drove significant client relationships, not just oversaw a team that did. Tobias hadn't been randomly hoarding our biggest accounts out of simple greed, though greed was certainly part of it. He'd been deliberately engineering his own personal revenue numbers ahead of a merger he already knew was coming, positioning himself for a retention bonus that could run into 6 figures, using 5 separate reps' hard-built client relationships as raw material to inflate a resume he was building for an entirely different company that hadn't even finished acquiring ours yet. Every one of us whose accounts he'd quietly claimed had unknowingly been financing his own soft landing into whatever came after the merger, while our own commission statements shrank and our own standing with leadership, ironically, looked weaker precisely because our numbers no longer reflected the work we were actually still doing behind the scenes to keep those relationships intact. Genevieve's contact in finance, a cautious woman who agreed to speak only on the condition that her name never appear in anything formal, confirmed one additional detail that made the whole scheme feel even colder once I understood it fully. The retention bonus calculation used a 12-month trailing average of personally attributed revenue, meaning the timing of each reassignment mattered enormously. Tobias hadn't taken all 5 accounts at once. He'd spaced them carefully across the qualifying window, ensuring his trailing average would look strong and consistent rather than suspiciously spiky, the kind of gradual, deliberate pacing that only makes sense if you already know exactly which 12-month window someone else is going to be measuring you against. I sat with all of this for several days before deciding what to do, and I want to be honest about the version of this story I almost told instead. Part of me wanted to confront Tobias directly, immediately, loudly enough that the whole floor would hear exactly what he'd done. I wanted that confrontation badly, the specific, immediate satisfaction of watching him scramble for an explanation in front of an audience. I didn't do that, mostly because Genevieve talked me through what would likely happen if I did. The moment you confront him directly, she said, he has time to quietly reverse a few of these reassignments, chalk the rest up to a misunderstanding, and bury the pattern before anyone above him ever sees the full picture. Right now, you have a documented pattern across 5 accounts. A private confrontation gives him room to make that pattern disappear. I understood the logic, but I want to be honest that following it required more patience than I felt like I had in me some days. There were entire evenings that week where I sat at my kitchen table rehearsing exactly what I'd say to him if I simply walked into his office the next morning, the specific, cutting sentences I wanted to watch land. I had to remind myself, more than once, that the version of justice that actually worked wasn't necessarily the version that felt best to imagine at 11 o'clock at night. So instead, Genevieve and I built a clean, factual document, the reassignment logs, the timestamp pattern showing Tobias approving his own requests, the 5 affected reps, and the total commission value involved, and the merger retention bonus structure Genevieve had found through her contact in finance. And I requested a meeting, not with Tobias, not with HR, but directly with our regional vice president, a measured, detail-oriented man named Percival, who oversaw our entire sales division and had, as far as either of us knew, no personal relationship with Tobias beyond the ordinary reporting structure. Percival read through everything in near silence for almost 20 minutes, while I sat across from him saying very little, letting the documentation do exactly what it needed to do. "Walk me through this approval chain again," he said finally, tapping the reassignment log. "You're telling me Tobias is both the requester and the approver on every single one of these transfers." "That's what the system shows," I said. "No secondary sign-off, no justification beyond the general language in the notification emails we all received." He was quiet for a long moment, the specific quiet of someone doing real math in his head, recalculating months of quarterly reports he'd likely reviewed and approved without ever noticing the pattern sitting underneath them. "And this retention bonus structure," he said, sliding the document toward the center of the table. "You're saying this incentivizes exactly the kind of behavior we're looking at here." "I'm telling you what the documentation shows," I said. "I'll let you draw your own conclusions about the timing." He was quiet for a long moment, before finally speaking again. "I want you to understand something," he said. "I signed off on quarterly numbers that included these reassignments without asking enough questions about why our 5 biggest accounts across the team all happened to route through one manager's personal ID within the same year. That's on me as much as it's on him. I'm going to need everything you have, formally, and I'm going to need to loop in HR and our compliance team before this goes any further." I remember feeling, for the first time in weeks, something closer to relief than fear as I sat across from him. Not because everything was resolved yet. It wasn't. Not by a long way. But because for the first time since that Friday evening reassignment email, someone with actual authority was looking at the same numbers I'd been staring at for weeks and reaching the same uncomfortable conclusion I had. He asked me one more question before I left his office that day, one that stayed with me longer than I expected. "Why did you come to me directly, instead of HR first?" "Because HR would have needed Tobias's side of the story before acting on anything," I said, and by the time that conversation happened, I was worried there wouldn't be much left to actually look at. He nodded slowly, like that answer confirmed something he'd already started suspecting about how carefully this had all been managed. Percival moved faster than either of us expected. Within a week, an internal audit was launched, specifically examining every account reassignment across the sales division over the preceding 18 months. Tobias was placed on administrative leave within days of that audit beginning, a decision made well above his own authority to influence or delay. The audit ultimately confirmed everything Genevieve and I had found, and uncovered 2 additional accounts beyond the 5 we already knew about, both following the identical pattern, both worth substantial commission value that had been quietly redirected to Tobias's own numbers over the same period. 2 of the other affected reps, once the audit results became known internally, reached out to me directly, both of them relieved and a little embarrassed that they'd each separately assumed their own reassignment was simply bad luck, never once suspecting a wider pattern because Tobias had been careful to space the transfers out across different quarters, never taking more than one major account at a time from the team as a whole. I didn't get to watch the meeting where Tobias was formally terminated, and honestly, by that point, I didn't need to. I'd gotten what I actually came for, the truth, documented, in front of the person with the authority to act on it, and the Lindquist account, restored formally to my ownership within 2 weeks, along with the full commission I'd been owed for the quarter it had been taken from me. I called the Lindquist procurement director myself, once the account was formally back under my name, mostly to make sure the transition hadn't disrupted anything on their end, while it had quietly bounced between owners. He hadn't noticed a thing, he told me, which meant either the interim handling had been smoother than I expected, or Tobias had been careful enough to keep the relationship stable while he was quietly claiming credit for maintaining it. I chose not to ask which one it actually was. I had everything I needed already, and some questions, I decided, weren't worth the extra energy of chasing down. Percival also implemented a new policy, directly as a result of what the audit uncovered, requiring any account reassignment above a certain revenue threshold to be approved by someone at least 2 levels above the requesting manager, with a written justification attached that the affected rep would also receive a copy of. I don't know if that policy would have caught what Tobias did any faster, But I take some quiet satisfaction in knowing it makes the next version of this scheme considerably harder to pull off undetected. The merger, as it turned out, closed 6 months later, regardless of any of this. I don't know whether Tobias ever collected any version of the retention bonus he'd been engineering his numbers toward, and I've made a kind of peace with not knowing. Whatever he was chasing, he wasn't chasing it with my client relationship anymore. I did hear, secondhand, that he landed a role at a different company within a few months, one apparently unaware of the reason he'd left ours. I felt a brief flash of anger at that, the specific unfairness of watching someone land softly after building his landing out of other people's work. It faded faster than I expected it to. I had my account back. I had my commission back. I had, more than anything, a version of proof I could point to, permanently, that the work I'd built over 4 years had actually belonged to me the entire time, regardless of what a single Friday evening email had tried to quietly claim otherwise. I want to be honest about what actually stayed with me longer than the satisfaction of getting the account back. I spent months assuming a strange, unexplained business decision had to have some reasonable justification behind it, because the person making it held authority over my job and spoke with enough confidence to make almost anything sound like ordinary strategy. I've thought a lot since then about how much of workplace trust depends on exactly that dynamic, the assumption that authority and confidence are reliable signals of legitimacy, when sometimes they're simply the tools someone uses to make a theft look like a policy. If you've ever had something taken from you at work, dressed up in language just official enough to make questioning it feel unreasonable, tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one, and if stories like this matter to you, subscribe, because there's more coming. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from realizing the thing protecting a wrongdoer wasn't cleverness at all, just the ordinary assumption that nobody underneath them would ever bother checking. I try to hold on to the opposite lesson now, in every part of my work, not just the accounts I manage. Confidence isn't proof of anything. It's just confidence. The only thing that actually tells you the truth is the paper trail underneath it, and I've learned to go looking for that trail a lot sooner than I used to. I still think about that first email sometimes, the plain, bloodless language of strategic realignment, and how close I came to simply accepting it, the way I suspect the other 4 reps mostly did, quietly, without ever comparing notes with each other, the way Genevieve and I eventually did. I wonder sometimes how differently this might have gone, if even one of us had felt able to ask the question out loud a little sooner. I try to make sure, now, that I'm the kind of coworker who makes that question easier for someone else to ask the next time something doesn't quite add up. I've made a point of checking in with newer reps on the team, more deliberately since all of this happened, not out of suspicion toward whoever manages them next, but simply because I know now how isolating it feels, to quietly wonder if you're imagining a pattern nobody else seems to notice. Genevieve and I still grab coffee most Fridays, an easy, ordinary habit that started during those weeks we spent piecing together spreadsheets after hours, and I don't think either of us has ever said out loud how much that quiet, unglamorous partnership actually mattered, not just to solving what happened, but to getting through it at all.